Today we are joined by my friend John Ross, who is going to help us discuss how to handle a large WeatherTRAK retrofit project. John comes to us from the SiteOne team in Southern California and has overseen many what I would consider large retrofit projects, right? So we got to kind of define what that means. So John, let's talk real quick about what you think of as a large WeatherTRAK retrofit. How big of are some of the projects that you are working on?
It can be anywhere, Ben, from 5 to 10 controller project, and probably the largest one is what we're currently working on right now is 250 to 300 controllers.
So the whole game.
Those are massive. Those are that's like winning in a lottery in the controller retrofit market, right?
Yeah, but central control is key in if you're trying to manage a 250 controller system, you got to have the visibility to manage that stuff.
Exactly.
So what we are going to drill into is really the physical process of what inheriting a system and walking through the process of, I have this old central control system and I want to upgrade to WeatherTRAK. What are the things that I need to look at? Where do I start? How do I proceed? We'll walk through the process of really qualifying the site and getting the right information to specify the right product. And in my eyes, it breaks down pretty simply. We're going to talk about the different levels of analysis that pre-sales requires, right? And the first thing we want to talk about for sure is how to find the right WeatherTRAK for your project. So when we are out in the world and we start to think about replacing our controllers with WeatherTRAK controllers, I provide a site analysis, a site survey, right? WeatherTRAK has a template for a site survey. And these are some of the things that I look at, right? I look at what type of controller we have. Is it a pedestal mount or a wall mount controller? I like to name the controller by where I find it so I can find it again when I come back to the site, and talk about how many stations there are and anything that's connected, like master valves and flow sensors and all the doodads that might be connected. John, is this kind of at the heart of what is your process of collecting this information?
Yeah, the first would be getting a list of the controllers and then going to each site and specifically looking at each site's controller location, because I can't tell you how many times I've been told, oh, it's just this. And then you actually go and then you ship the product and you get out and then you get the phone call saying, this isn't going to fit in this enclosure. So critical to learn the hard way to go out to each site. And although it's time consuming, it's well worth it to double check what the spreadsheet says it is and go out there and take a look so that you know what needs to go out there. Plus, the other factor is you might encounter other information by viewing that area that you didn't know was going to happen, whether it's further on down your list, you have the point of connections and those aspects of it. But going to the site and realizing that even though the list says that it's this, I'd say probably 30% of the time, that's not exactly true.
Trust but verify, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. So when you are looking at these qualifiers on a controller, one of the things that I wanted to pick your brain about is with the 3 different lines that WeatherTRAK offers, and we're going to get into OptiFlow a little bit later, so you don't have to qualify that one. But how do you decide which product you're going to specify, whether you go with the LC or the Pro 3? And we'll roll that into a conversation later about OptiFlow as well.
Mm-hmm. Little of it is budget. So right off the bat, you ask the customer kind of what your budget is. So that kind of guides you to which way he wants to go. A little of it is what he's used been maybe on the rest of the project has, maybe if it's already been started. So if they're already Pro 3s, probably keep with Pro 3s. The budget factor is typically the biggest factor of all of getting them the, which way or which controller type they want to go with.
Okay. And then these other things that I want to touch on really are finding the right controller, right? So when we're doing that analysis, one of the things we are looking at is, how do I fit this controller into the landscape? And so one of the things I wanted to highlight is the different options for the different styles of WeatherTRAK that we provide that you might want to specify. So first and foremost, the old standby, the tried and true workhorse of the WeatherTRAK family is the wall mount controller, right? Most of the time we see the controllers mounted on the wall. It's easy to take down the old controller and put the new one up. Sometimes we find pedestals out in the field. And when we find pedestals out in the field, it sparks a whole new conversation, right? Do we want to go with a new stainless steel pedestal or a controller specific pedestal? We call the C-ped, that you can put a wall mount controller on top of this little pedestal and make a pedestal out in the field. Or do we want to use the existing enclosures? One of the things that WeatherTRAK does very well, and especially in partnership with SiteOne, is these chassis mount controllers, where we can take an existing enclosure and replace the internal components, replace the guts, leave the stainless steel box, but take whatever controller is in there out and replace it with a WeatherTRAK. So how do you approach this conversation with your customers? How do you decide what pedestal or what option to use for your customers?
A lot of it is, if it's stainless steel, typically those controllers are that location is bulletproof, because you can swap out the interior products of the existing enclosure and just build it right inside the old enclosure at that site. The other fact, a lot of them, and I'm glad you brought up the enclosure type, because a lot of these sites you're dealing with old steel enclosures, and it might be time for those old enclosures to get replaced, and let's get a new stainless steel enclosure in there and get it swapped out. And in your picture here, like you show, and once again, budget is a lot of the factor, right? So maybe they only can afford to use a light duty front entry there, even though they'd like the $1,500 top entry. So it all depends what the site's needs are, what the customer's wants are, what they're looking for, as far as when it comes to the enclosure type. And a lot of times what a lot of people are doing, then, to be honest, is they have your typical front entry enclosure, and they'll just put a CWM inside it and call it a day. And they like the double protection of the stainless steel enclosure, and then they close the CWM's doors on it. So a little bit of a box and box, not a little bit, it's a box and a box, but you get a little bit of double protection for what they want to do.
So one of the things that brings to mind, the issue that I see with that is the communication out of that steel box, right? If you're doing that, you definitely have to keep the communication signals in mind. Not only the cellular connection of the WeatherTRAK, but also the wireless rain sensor is sometimes affected by having that box in the box effect. What do you do about that when you see it in the field?
All of our anything that's inside a stainless steel box, the antenna goes on the outside. We don't even attempt to put the antenna on the inside.
Yeah, I mean, I have done a lot of troubleshooting with people over the phone to try and figure out communication issues. Every time I open this door, it's online, but when I go away, gee, I wonder what the mystery here is. All right. So any other tips and tricks about controller assessment, things that you do to save time or improve the customer experience?
The biggest thing is going out to the site. I think no matter what list you have, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten burned on believing what the list says or believing the customer, and then you go out there and it's not the case. I'll give perfect example is this past week, a guy asked me for a quote for whatever his list was, and I said, man, this isn't sounding right. And then I called the actual end user and I said, hey, what do you guys actually have out there? Are you going to upgrade an existing Pro 2? Oh no. Oh, I go, okay, because they have a bunch of old Pro 2s out there. He goes, we have this. And it was nothing what the list or what the quote we were providing the contractor was for the project. So yeah, that's I think the most critical factor is verifying what's out in the field so that you know what you're getting your hands into.
And one other thing that I really wanted to highlight as a question, a process, something for people working on these types of projects would encounter, controller consolidation. One of the things that I am big on is making sure that we use as few actual controllers as possible. Do you have an opinion on controller consolidation?
Absolutely. I'm 100% on board with you on that as well, Ben. So another project that we've been working on, they have a lot of back-to-back enclosures or even closures that are right next to each other. You have two controllers that are a foot away from each other. We'll put a pipe between the two and bring the wires through to the other side to consolidate the amount of controllers that are on the project. And many a times it's to help manage the point of connection issue and get away with a lot of the older projects have two controllers and one point of connection. So that just helps you get away with having two controllers, and then managing two controllers, that aspect of it can be a nightmare. And obviously having two communication points.
Right.
There's no need for it. If you can eliminate one, that would be great.
Absolutely. And with the 72 and 96 station controllers, I think WeatherTRAK is in a prime position to have this conversation, right? So many of the standard controllers have those standard station counts. So yep, it doesn't really occur to most people doing a retrofit to think about, hey, I've got two controllers sitting side by side right here. Can I fit them into one? Especially when you're looking at 248 station controllers side by side, right? But with WeatherTRAK, we've got that 96 that is a great opportunity for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the other thing you nailed on the head was the subscription, right? The main conversation about consolidation and limiting the number of WeatherTRAKs that you have is the recurring subscription that goes along with each controller. The more stations we can stick onto one subscription, the better off long-term that customer is going to be. So that's a big topic for just analyzing retrofit opportunities, consolidation where it is possible, even if it means moving a controller or reconfiguring things. If you encourage your customers to consolidate, it pays for itself very quickly by eliminating that extra communication and subscription cost. All right, all right. Anything else on controller swap before we start talking about how you choose when we deploy flow?
No, I don't have anything, man.
All right, let's talk about flow. Oh, here's a cheat sheet. Sorry, I added a cheat sheet for the controller analysis step. This is something that you'll find in the WeatherTRAK price guide, that as you are working through the checklist of, hey, I have these site conditions, or I'm looking for these features, this will give you a good idea of what WeatherTRAK has that qualifies to meet your site needs. So this is a great tool that you'll find in the price guide that helps walk you through the differences in the configurations and the differences in the models, and can be very, very helpful in a project like this. All right, so now let's talk about all of the things that you need to analyze when you want to add flow onto a WeatherTRAK system. And here is my list. Like this shameless plug. I stole all of these analysis slides from my OptiFlow site assessment training. So if you want to really drill down on what all of this actually means, you should check out my Learn Upon Level 2 OptiFlow class called OptiFlow Site Assessment. But when you're analyzing flow, it takes way more work than just looking at a controller, right? It takes a lot of details to get that system right. What is your process for this?
You're exactly right. It's you have to have somebody on the site who kind of knows the site a little bit, because once again, same thing. You go out to the site and the guy that's walking you around has no idea where the point of connections are, where the meters are, where it's going. Just did a project a couple months back where, oh yeah, we only have one point of connection. And then come to find out a month later that, oh, actually there is another meter way up the street that it ties into the main line as well. So, and the hard part is a lot of these projects, they're turned over from contractor to contractor, and the new contractor on the job, he doesn't know that information. So it's some hit or miss a lot of times, but it helps a lot if the actual irrigator on the project is walking the site with you, and just not the property manager or even the maintenance contractor's foreman, because he's not in the weeds doing it day in, day out. Or the guy who's the irrigator, who's been to that site before, he knows what is on those areas.
Yeah, it's amazing what you learn by turning the water off on these systems, right? If you're the irrigator, you've gone through the process of, hey, let's shut this system down. How many backflows do I need to shut down to get this system to actually turn off?
Absolutely.
And property managers are, you're 100% right. I have been red herringed by more property managers on, oh, this is just easy, no problem. And then we'll try and blind qualify the proper in-ground equipment and not get it right.
Doesn't work. Yeah.
So when you are qualifying flow sensors, how do you go to figure out which flow sensor is right for a project?
Kind of ask, once again, it's just asking a bunch of questions to see. And typically the biggest question is, how low is what's your lowest flow valve on this controller? Because if you have a 2-inch main line and they're looking to see the flow coming out of that drip valve at 1 or 2 gallons, a 2-inch flow sensor isn't going to work for you. So just kind of knowing what the mainline size is, as well as what their lowest flow is super helpful. Because the worst thing you can do is install this stuff and then they get out there and you're like, oh, I'm not seeing the flow on this. It's giving me a no flow reading when stations 2, 7, and 12 are running. And you're like, well, what do you got? And you turn it on and you're like, well, we have these little planners over here that those zones run.
I've got one barely connected to this zone. I don't know why it's not reading.
It's barely 1 or 2 GPM. Happens all the time, especially like on apartment projects, and they have their little podiums, that a couple bubblers are on it, and that's all that's running. Or you have maybe a station with a bubbler zone, and same thing, super low flows. So that all part of the assessment of knowing how much flow is going from each station, and then setting them up with the proper flow sensor. And a lot of times there is no flow sensor, or the flow sensor that's there isn't working. So you kind of have to go around and once again do your homework if you want it to be done right, and double check everything.
Right, double check understand all of the points of all of the individual components of what I call the point of connection, right? The source, the backflow, mainline, anything that exists. If you're doing a retrofit project, you have to know if there's a master valve, and if so, what kind of master valve, if there's a flow sensor, and if so, what kind of flow sensor.
Yeah.
And then if not, that's when we get into that real interesting conversation about how do we decide what to add. So that's all the homework that John Ross was talking about. One other interesting perspective on this, John, that has recently come to light for me. I was always of the low flow conversation on flow sensors as well, but recently I have been hit with systems that are crushing flow sensors over the top of their available readings, of their accurate range, right? So you're saying you got to be careful of having stations that are lower than your smallest availability to read. And what I saw yesterday and a few times over the last year is, especially with OptiFlow, we have systems going in that maybe a 2-inch flow sensor is monitoring a looped main where the pipe actually is bigger in the ground. What we had yesterday was the point of connection was 2 inches. We put a 2-inch flow sensor in there, and 20 yards down, they bumped that pipe up to 4-inch, and we were just crushing that flow sensor. The top range of the flow sensor was only going up to 100 gallons a minute, and we were learning flows at 120 gallons a minute. So gotta, in my eyes, understand the whole range, right? Understand everything that you're trying to do with it, not just the low flows, but the high flows as well.
Absolutely.
And then does the model of flow sensor make a difference to you? Do you have a preference on what type of flow sensor people are installing?
Not specifically, no. As far as like I mean, a lot of it is what your resolution is that you want to see. So if the standard schedule 80 228s, that seems to be the norm that a lot of people use out here. Some people use CSTs, and then I have some guys who really want to get their flow dialed in super tight, and will go with the ultrasonics. I have a couple customers who are really liking the ultrasonics, and then I have a couple guys who use the hydrometers. So it seems like personal preference with from when it comes to what type of flow sensor that some of these customers want to use.
Awesome. I see the same thing. Like the only time that the qualifier for me on that flow 3 is the ease of install, right? Depending on who I'm talking to and how many flow sensors they've installed. If their answer is 0, I always point them to the flow 3 because the results are so easy to achieve with that hardware, right? That hardware makes the flow installation easier and more reliable results on the other end. So that's one thing I definitely keep in mind. If you're cramped for space or you don't have an experienced flow sensor installer, that flow 3 is a lights out solution that will get you to the finish line. All right, here we go. John Ross, now that we have talked about how you decide what controller and talked about how you decide what flow sensor, how do you decide when you talk to customers about OptiFlow?
I think after much experience with dealing with this thing, you really got to qualify. Do they have a user who can actually use the product? Because couple instances where you put that in and yeah, this is a perfect project for it, and then the guy who's actually running the system has no clue about how to run the system. It's a critical factor.
Yeah.
So so you could have a perfect site that makes total sense for OptiFlow, but if the guy behind the steering wheel can't drive the car, it's going to fail for you 100% of the time, every single time. So one of the qualifying steps that we never asked initially was, who's driving this bus here, running your system? And I think it's critical to ask that question, along with, you have two controllers pulling from that same main line. Oh, that's a perfect OptiFlow site. Oh, okay, who's going to be running this now? So very, very critical.
Yeah, for
And,
sure.
and when I say who's going to be running it, meaning they need to be trained on how to run it, because, and I'm not saying that somebody can't do it, but you just can't assume that this person's going to take the ball and run with it. They need to be trained on it.
Furthermore, you can't assume that even a good irrigation tech can just pick up OptiFlow with no training and understand all that it's trying to do and all of the management specifics, right? Not I don't call them challenges, but there, I mean, it's definitely got its own set of rules that you have to follow.
And that it's just not something that you walk into and you start running day one, with your eyes closed. It's you kind of got to get a feel for it and learn it. It's not it's not like riding a bike.
See, and that was not at all the answer I expected out of you, John Ross. I thought for sure we were going to be talking about hardware configurations and station counts.
I was trying to go to the stuff that people aren't thinking of. And
absolutely.
That's certainly one answer. Of them. As far as the actual setup of the OptiFlow system, yes, your usual, like you go over through your trainings, Ben. What's your pipe sizing? What do you have? Who's tied to that? What is tied to that main line? Are there any other meters tied to this main line besides the one that you think is there? Had an instance where, once again, I had multiple controllers in here. There were two backflows on the backside of the property that nobody ever thought to look at that are tied to this thing on this loop system. So it's all those little instances of you really got to get out there and take a look, as well as if you're lucky enough to have maybe an old set of plans that you can look at to kind of give you a rough idea of what you might have been getting into. That's awesome if you have that luxury.
I tried to stifle the outward laughter when you talk about irrigation plans. Like it's a unicorn Ben, that I very rarely find.
Even if, like, I was dealing with the one of the schools here, universities, even if you could get a rough idea of what, even if the plans are old, what kind of what they had in the ground, even though it might have changed throughout the years a little bit, you kind of have at least an idea of what we might be getting into. That's super helpful as well.
Absolutely. Well, that was awesome, John. Thank you for your insight on that. I know it's helpful to people who are working through the process. My friend Scott Hunt says definitely OptiFlow setup is not for your first year irrigation techs. So
not at all.
We all concur with that. That is something on that note, when you do have a qualified user, I definitely encourage you to use our free on-demand certified OptiFlow training. It's part of what you get, and it will successfully walk you through all of the process and all of the different rules and ins and outs of OptiFlow. So definitely, when you have recruited the right person, make sure they get the right training as well. Mm-hmm. All right, so we are headed toward our cutoff time, and I need to finish up by asking you the same thing I ask all of my first-time guests. What does WeatherTRAK save you?
What does it save me? Wow, that's a great question, Ben. I think the most valuable thing that you can never get back, Ben, is time. And that aspect of time is the number one most important thing I think WeatherTRAK does for me, whether it's dealing with the internal folks within the company that are awesome and spectacular and help you out every time I've asked for any type of help.
Any shout outs here? Anybody internally that helps you?
Well, my go-to guy is Charles there, and he's spectacular. Yourself, when I've called you, instant answers to the guys that I deal with out in the field, the technicians, the Phil Elliott's of the world. the Megs and the Janines when I needed some literature pieces for that. I mean, just all encompassing when you need answers and you got to have it. What's the critical factor is time, right? Because usually if somebody's calling, it's not because they're looking for an answer from a week from now. And the response is always great. And then time on the other aspect is how the product performs and works. You're not spending a bunch of time troubleshooting. It's a reliable product, as well as it saves you time in the field, whether it comes to your programming or rain shutdowns, the flow sensing aspect of the product. So all of those things, it all boils down to time, and time is so valuable. And I think that's the breadth of what you look for in a good product is that aspect. How is this product saving me time? And I
lowest
think
cost of ownership, right? That's what we
Yeah.
pride ourselves on, is how many calories does it take to keep this train moving? That's
exactly.
a great answer. Thank you, John. Let me give a plug for next week, and then we will wrap this thing up. So this was my summary slide. I just blew right past it. And talking about the difference in main lines, right? This is where I thought you were going to go with OptiFlow, talking about how the different main lines have to be analyzed and when stuff is shared on that main line. Wrap up talking about support. We're always here to help. Please let us know if there's any support that you need. We have automated training materials, 6-day-a-week bilingual customer support if you have field questions, and automated support materials through the interwebs that can help troubleshoot and find all of the product knowledge that you need. And join us next week when my friend, I put that in the wrong order. When my friend Brad Stopkati will be our special guest. He is the grounds manager for the Garden City Public Schools in Garden City, Kansas. And he is in the middle of his WeatherTRAK deployment and has some insight on how he uses WeatherTRAK mobile to troubleshoot his systems and stations out in the field and some of the tools that are involved with that. So that's what we'll be doing next week. Join us and we will be happy to have you back. So thank you all for tuning in, and most especially John Ross, thank you for making time for us this morning. I really enjoyed talking to you and benefiting from your experience. You have anything to close out the session?
No, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
I did too. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.